My next quote, and this is the last quote in my bit, is also about NATO, and it's from Professor Robert Service, who wrote in The Observer this weekend. And he also says that the murmurings about the onset of a new Cold War will help nobody, and that NATO's eastward expansion is provoking Russian paranoia. But in your book, you write that the eastward expansion of NATO and Euro-Atlanticism has not been easy, but yet has been very positive. And you quote Poland as an example, you quote the Baltic states. So should Russian protestations be just dismissed?
Well, I think one has to distinguish between what one might call manufactured hysterics and real Russian fears. Now, if one was looking at the map, one would say there are two things that, and looking at the statistics, there are two things that Russia ought to be really scared of. And one's China and the other's Muslims. And those are big threats for Russia. You have the most resource-rich part of Russia is the most thinly populated, and it's next to a very thickly populated part of China. And the Muslim birth rate in Russia is very high, and the Slav Russian birth rate is low, and Russia has very troubled relations both with the North Caucasus and potentially with Central Asia. And so it seems to me those are real fears. I think it's perfectly reasonable to talk to Russia more seriously about nukes, and in fact I do argue very strongly in the book that the American administration has been wrong to assume that dominance equals stability. It was crazy, I think, to rip up the ABM treaty and not press ahead with START 3, and both sides would be better off with deep cuts in their strategic nuclear arsenals, and it's quite reasonable, I think, for Russia to try and attract some attention on that. And I think it's also very reasonable that if Russia is the second biggest space power after the United States, to try and have some kind of international legal order in space. So on those things, I think Russia has a case. I don't think the case on NATO expansion stacks up. NATO is, the expansion of NATO to Poland, first of all to Central Europe and then to the Baltics and the Balkans, has always been accompanied by this kind of breast-beating hysterics from Russia about this is going to be an absolute disaster. But the effect has actually been very positive. This has calmed down these countries. Do you really think, if you remember what the Baltic states were like in the mid-1990s, with these excitable amateurish militias, with mutinies happening, with all sorts of dangers of provocation, and now you have small, well-disciplined militaries that are part of, heavily integrated into NATO, and it seems to me that must be good for Russia to have stable, democratic, well-governed neighbours, and the spread of the EU and NATO eastwards has created a zone of stability and security and prosperity, which one would think Russia would be pleased about, and it seems to me rather troubling that Russia gets on very well with countries when they're dictatorships, so it has excellent relations with Uzbekistan and Belarus, and yet finds it so difficult to get on with the democracies on its borders.
My question is about President Putin. You mentioned judo as one of his talents, but in your book you have a very interesting chart which shows his popularity, his rise from zero to hero, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
How did he do it?
Well, I think one point I make very strongly in the book is I'm not saying that the 1990s were a wonderful time for Russia, and then the ex-KGB came along and ruined it. And I think we simply can't understand what's happening now in Russia unless we take off our perhaps rather rose-tinted spectacles when we look at the 1990s. That I think that the way the Kremlin portrays the 1990s is a bit unfair, but for most Russians this was a time of huge economic dislocation, collapse of industry, theft of national assets by oligarchs, the feeling the country was disintegrating, perhaps most of all the feeling of embarrassment, that the head of state was this embarrassing drunk who couldn't get off the plane to meet the Irish Prime Minister and seized the baton and tried to conduct a military band during a visit to Germany. And I think any country would find that was a rather a repellent period. And I think what Putin has done very successfully is to portray his rule and the rule of the ex-KGB people around him as not only a contrast but also an antidote to those 1990s. Now, the way it happened, I think, is quite troubling, and as I point out in the book, the apartment bombings of 1999, I think, are one of the big loose threads that, if they were tugged hard, a lot of this sort of image of Putin as the great leader would come undone. The other big thread which should be pulled hard is the corruption. and the question of beneficial ownership. Who owns Gunvor? Who owns Skylink? Who owns Megafon? Who owns Gas? The list continues. But corruption and the apartment block bombings in 1999, I think, are big loose threads. Now, what the apartment block bombings did was to take Russian public opinion and kind of crystallize it behind the feeling that the country was under attack by these apparently very well organized terrorists who were killing hundreds of Russians in their sleep. And therefore the answer was a very strong leader. Now, I think that was very cynical, and I look in some detail in the book at particularly the Ryazan bombing, where I just don't think that the official explanation makes sense. Why would two FSB officers steal a car, drive to Ryazan, and then buy sacks of sugar in the market, put real detonators and timers on them, and then put them in an unguarded basement in order to test security? That is the official version. I'm not making this up. That is
a defence exercise.
But whose vigilance are you trying to test? And added to all the other circumstantial evidence, so I'm afraid, I can't prove this, but I think the balance of evidence is that the authorities had a hand in the 1999 bombings, and that Mr. Putin was a beneficiary. I wouldn't necessarily go as far as saying he knew what was happening then, and that he was directly involved in ordering it. But I do find it very troubling, and I think that this manipulation of public opinion is one of the things that has helped him retain popularity all the way through. Most Russians get their information from television, and the television is under Kremlin control and gives Putin an extremely easy ride. These carefully staged photo opportunities in the sort of action man, Superman sort of poses of fishing, piloting planes, stripped to the waist, on the judo mat, all this sort of thing, and an extraordinary reluctance to ask tough questions. And I think, it's one of the really striking things is the record of Putin over the last 8 years, and the government has actually been rather incompetent. They've had this bonanza of tens of billions of dollars coming in from the high oil and gas prices, which has sent living standards shooting up, and that's great, and obviously a great contrast to the 1990s. But where are the new roads? Even Mr. Medvedev's own think tank admits that the amount of paved roads in Russia has gone down since 2000. That's really striking. They say there are two big problems in Russia, fools and roads. Well, we can't judge the fools, but on the roads, where are the new motorways?
One more question about winners and losers. One of the chapters in your book is entitled Winners and Losers of This Regime. The winners are sort of obvious. We know who they are, and you mentioned yourself the living standards, the average earnings are up, and the rest of it. Who are the losers in this setup?
Well, I think you have to look inside and outside Russia when you talk about the losers. And I think, inside Russia, the losers are really everybody who might have benefited from a real modernization of infrastructure and public services. That we've seen enormous debts being built up by Russian companies, corruption entrenched to a level that would have been unimaginable even in the Yeltsin era. And I suspect that people will look back on this period and say, where did all the money go? We had the 10 years of not just high but rising oil prices, and actually, we blew it. And so I think in one sense the losers are all Russians. I think the ethnic minorities inside Russia are having a very tough time at the moment, and the sort of institutionalization of state racism is really worrying. I was absolutely horrified to see reports of a meeting of the Moscow police chief with representatives of all the ethnic minority communities in Russia, in Moscow, who'd gone to see him to talk about the wave of racist attacks. I think there was at one point there was a racist murder happening every day in Moscow, and his response was, well, why don't you make sure that your ethnic minority communities commit fewer crimes, and then there wouldn't be any reason to attack you. And that was, I was absolutely sort of astonishingly sort of a bad response. But I think that the losers right now are the countries outside Russia, because we are losing, and we're seeing the Finlandization of Western Europe and the re-establishment of a kind of political and economic dominance of Russia in Eastern Europe, and that's really worrying. And if you look at what's happened just in the months of this year with the South Stream pipeline, where we've seen Serbia, which admittedly has no reason to love the West right now, but also Bulgaria and Hungary, just falling into the Russian camp on South Stream, that is a loss to all of Europe. We are losing our energy security as we speak.